Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Who or what is the devil? What does it mean to be saved? Will things or beings we consider evil eventually be saved by God, who won't be able to resist doing so?
Hello, and welcome to the 821st edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I am Ben, and those unusual questions came from my co-host and partner in the paranormal and dad, Paul. Today we offer an unusual look at a subject that's somewhat off the beaten path for us, or is it? And we welcome your calls today. The number is 401-766-1240, and that's from anywhere. Or email Paul at behindtheparanormal.com, or you can contact us via Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
David Bentley Hart has been Director's Fellow and a Templeton Fellow in Residence at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, a prolific author widely regarded as one of the most influential academic theologians in the English-speaking world. Dr. Hart has also held positions at St. Louis University, the University of Virginia, Duke University, and Providence College, our own favorite institution here in Rhode Island almost, only a few miles from where we are originating the show today. His specialties include philosophical theology, systematics, patristics, classical and continental philosophy, Asian religion, classic and Christian metaphysics, ontology, the metaphysics of the soul, and the philosophy of mind. That's it. Our discussion today will center around his latest book, published in September by Yale University Press, That All Shall Be Saved, Heaven, Hell, and Universal Salvation.
So, Dr. David Bentley Hart, welcome to Behind the Paranormal.
Well, thanks for having me.
Oh, well, it's great to have you with us. So let's just jump right in here. We're always careful to define our terms on this show because people do hear things according to their own paradigms, and we have a very diverse audience. So what do we mean by the terms heaven, hell, and universal salvation?
Well, the first two we tend to mean things that we can conceive of and imagine, but that in all likelihood don't correspond to any reality. In fact, in the earliest centuries of Christianity, there was no concept of heaven and hell as such. There was the age to come, which would include the whole cosmos, and that was what we were looking forward to, not just a post-mortem state in heaven or hell. And the question was whether you would be part of that new age, of that new restored cosmos or not. What we mean by heaven and hell today are fairly gauzy images of an afterlife, either one full of puppies and flowers, or one that involves a great deal of physical pain. As for universal salvation, that means just what it seems to mean, whether or not the salvation that specifically Christians hope for encompasses all persons, all beings, all of reality, or whether it's simply intended, or whether salvation applies only to a select and rather small group of individuals.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense to us, certainly. If anyone is wondering why we're covering this on a paranormal show, we're both very, very interested in it ourselves, and the devil is the most famous villain in many paranormal scenarios. Of course, all you have to do is look at all the movies out there and all that stuff. There are those in our audience who have a problem with the idea of a personal devil, for lack of a better term. And as we get into the issue of universal salvation, what do you have to say about that? About a personal devil, as some people may conceive it? As you say, the reality may be far deeper and beyond our paradigm. But what say you?
Yeah, well, that's the problem. Is the answer I would give, or will give now, if you've got 6 or 7 hours to spare. We'll
do a couple of shows.
Complicated. The image of Lucifer, the chief fallen angel or archon of the heavenly court, is one that sort of developed over time. And in fact, even the name Lucifer comes to be attached to him almost by an accidental association with the verse in Isaiah later on in Christian history. The only figure identified with the actual star, Phosphorus or Lucifer in the New Testament, believe it or not, is Jesus. So that particular story is a conflation of a lot of different elements in Scripture. But the idea that there were evil agencies and, in fact, an evil archon or ruler of this world is very much part of the original Christian story. And for the Apostle Paul, for instance, salvation largely consists in Christ having conquered these legions of powers and principalities and dominions, by which he means mutinous angelic or demonic powers on high, and having restored order to the cosmos in Christ, so that on the last day everything can be put back, restored to its proper order, with God being all in all and all things subject to him. So the idea of personal spiritual evil in the spiritual world, that's part of the Christian story from early on, but precisely how it's depicted and understood, the notion of the kind of the bearded or mustachioed sophisticate in a velvet smoking jacket overseeing the tortures in hell and coming up with ever more cunning ways to lure people into his embrace. That's part of later Christian mythology. And so you have to dissociate the two. I think, yes, I do believe that there's real spiritual evil.
Sure. One of the points that often are brought up to us by people who, and I've contributed modestly to the literature on this, is the issue of an equally bad God and a good God, which is, of course, right out of Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism and everything else, which seems to have been picked up in early Christianity, because it didn't seem to be part of Judaism. I mean, the influences of early Christianity, in your opinion, according to your knowledge, are they present today in these interpretations?
I mean, to be honest, first of all, in Zoroastrianism, which had many different epochs, Ahriman is never quite the equal of the Ahura Mazda. No, they're not actually co-equal, but there is, an evil deity that is almost, and who is a very formidable rival to the good God and is a kind of creator in his own right. That actually did influence both Judaism and Christianity in the early century. It definitely influenced Jewish thought in the intertestamental period. And so the very notion, say, the images we have of eschatological judgment and of Beliar or Samael or Samael, well, it depends. There are different names for the evil one, Mastema in some of the literature. That is influenced by Persian thought. But it took deeper hold in Christianity. It's still there, in the demonology of a lot of Orthodox rabbinical Judaism. But it did become kind of the cosmic picture. So Jews and Christians, as a result of the Persian rule, there was a period in the intertestamental period when, Israel is under the rule of Persian power, and then under Seleucid power, which is, of course, Hellenistic Persian. And it did influence the development of Jewish thought and then Christian thought. And we have inherited that somewhat dualistic vision of reality. And in a sense, we're all heirs of Zoroaster, I guess.
Apparently. Well, I have nothing like your academic credentials. I spent a lot of years in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox seminaries, and only once do I remember the notion of universal salvation coming up. And it was in a context of and I'd never heard of it before. How widespread was this debate in the early church? And there was, to the best of my knowledge, one council where it came up. Was it Second Constantinople in the 6th century?
Right, the Fifth Ecumenical Council. It didn't actually come up with the council. That's a myth. It was it was inserted into the canons of the council after the fact by the emperor or by agents thereof. But we know that it was never actually discussed at the council. And in fact, what was condemned wasn't universal salvation as such. It was a very particular set of teachings that were later attributed to Origen of Alexandria.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to ask about Origen.
But in fact, were not his teachings. So it's actually, with the Fifth Ecumenical Council, whatever it discussed, it didn't discuss universal salvation, and whatever was condemned in those spurious canons that were inserted later, it's still not universalism as such. It's just one set of teachings that were rather odd if you read them.
I never realized that. That's amazing. Just to help our listeners kind of catch up with some of this. Now we're all a bunch of people who are have some theological education here, so we don't want to leave people behind. There's a rule: never talk down to your listeners or write down to your readers. However, for those who don't know, there are 7 ecumenical councils or gatherings of bishops, which were usually quite local, as opposed to today.
The Orthodox number them at 7.
The Orthodox number them at 7.
After the 16th century, the Catholic Church added.
They had their own,
the 21.
All the way up to the early 60s with the Second Vatican Council, which the Orthodox don't accept. But nevertheless, they were maybe I'm oversimplifying here, Doctor, you could correct me, but when there were issues to be resolved, doctrinal or otherwise, the bishops would get together and discuss a solution to this, and usually come up with one. And the emperor, back when the Roman Empire was still viable, had more influence than the Pope of Rome ever did.
Also known as Caesaropapism.
Right, precise. Thank you, Ben. Don't try and spell it. But in any case, that's the background of what we're discussing. So this has never come up. The issue of universal salvation or any doctrine revolving around it has not come up officially in church discussions, particularly Orthodox, or even beyond that?
Well, there have been plenty of theological discussions, but if you're talking about the 7 ecumenical councils, no. And again, the 5th ecumenical council, the records we had of it were distorted by the way it was promulgated. But we know, and this is a matter of historical fact, that the issue was never actually discussed by the bishops there. They were concerned with a set of issues completely different, having to do with certain theologians in Antioch. So, yeah, no, it hasn't. But I mean, over time, of course, as far as Rome is concerned, I mean, especially in the Catechism, you'll find what are more or less doctrinal teachings. But in the Orthodox East, there are those who will claim, based on the spurious canons I mentioned, that universalism's been condemned, but as a matter of historical fact, no, it hasn't, and the best scholars all agree on that. The issue, though, that you raised earlier is the interesting one, is how widespread was it in the early centuries? And all the evidence suggests it was quite widespread, especially in the East, because even as late as the late 4th century, St. Basil the Great, of whom you probably have heard if you have an Orthodox background, reported that most of the Christians he knew were Universalists. That is, they all believed in hell, but they believed that it was a temporary thing, that it was a process, that it is a process of purgation by which wounded, fallen, or wicked souls are gradually restored and ultimately saved.
Okay.
And that's based on, after all, the verse right out of 1 Corinthians. So.
Okay. All right. I'll repeat the title of your book, Doctor, that all shall be saved, heaven, hell, and universal salvation. Now, I looked over some of the reviews. I haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet. I will. I've ordered it. But some of the reviews, particularly from evangelical sources, are rather dismissive at best and hostile at worst.
Oh, yeah. In fact, I told my editors, this isn't going to be, my books are always provocative, but I told Yale, in this case, the people will be provoking, will be more passionate and more, frankly, a little bit more demented at times. The good reviews come from people who already agreed, the bad reviews from people who disagree. The thing about the bad reviews so far that I'm pleased to report is that none of them has actually accurately reported any of the arguments in the book. So that either means that they weren't able to follow the arguments, which would be sort of disappointing, because I tried to make them as clear as possible. They are philosophical arguments, but I didn't try to make them impenetrable to an intelligent readership. or it means that they, found the arguments sufficiently difficult that they had to resort instead to invective. I don't know. But so far, the negative reviews have been pleasing in the sense that none of them so far has actually touched on any of the actual arguments that appear in the book. And many of them consist in taking passages out of context to make it seem like I say all sorts of insulting things about people who believe in eternal damnation. Whereas, in fact, the phrases that are taken out of context don't refer to people at all. They have to do with very specific ideas that at various times have cropped up in Christian history.
Sounds a bit like modern politics, actually.
It is, but the question that I find attaches to it is, why are so many people passionately committed to the idea of eternal damnation when I could challenge other aspects of their faith and they would push back, but probably not with the same passion. There are a lot of people for whom the idea of eternal hell is more important, perhaps, than almost any other aspect of their faith. And it's very strange when you see that come to the surface.
So there's a really fascinating podcast I followed for a very long time, and I have no idea if you're familiar with it or if you even have time to delve into it. It's by Father John Strickland. It's called Paradise and Utopia. It is I figured you're a busy man.
I don't do a lot of online anything.
That's what I figured.
This is an exotic experience for me.
Well, thank you for joining us for this exotic experience. So it's fascinating. It talks about early Christian history, and it sort of goes through the rise and fall of Christendom, as it were. And he did a very interesting portion on Western Europe and this sort of rise of sort of a pessimistic piety around the 9th century. So with that sort of kept in mind, where did this sort of idea of this sort of myth, this new sort of myth of Satan or the devil or whoever sort of appear? Was it around that period of sort of a new pessimism?
Well, no, I think it had been taking shape. There was always a belief that, as Paul says, the God of this age, that is, that the world is under the power of archons, or that's the word he uses in Greek. And that, but there's no idea of a kingdom of hell in Paul. Rather, it's that this cosmos, you might almost say this cosmos in its present state is hell for us, and that Christ came to liberate us and the cosmos as a whole. And I use that word cosmos rather than word just because I want to make clear that's the word used in Greek, that we understand that it means a universal restoration, not just of souls, but Paul is quite clear on this, as is most of Scripture, the whole of creation. And that notion, however, you're right, was not pessimistic at first. The early Christian literature that comes to us is triumphalistic. It's all Christ has conquered these powers. But it is true that, and it might have something to do with the decay of the Roman Empire as such in the West, the gradual falling apart of social order, the general decline of civilization in the West, and what used to be called the Dark Ages, and the 9th century would fit in that paradigm, at the end of it. But it's hard to locate exactly. It is clear that certain pictures of Christianity began to emerge that had a kind of tragic cast to them. The notion that, whereas the New Testament, Christ's death on the cross is always depicted as a kind of victory over the power of death. It's Christ penetrating to the realm of the dead. And there's a word in Greek, litron or anti-litron, that means, it's often translated ransom, but it just merely meant the price paid to set the slaves free. It's civil law. It doesn't mean a ransom. You start later Christian thought, and especially in the West, the notion that the death of Christ on the cross appeases the wrath of the Father, or that we're born already guilty and loathsome in the eyes of God. Whereas, again, that's a distinctively Western, and I would bore you stiff, but I could go into all of the reasons why certain translations of the New Testament led to this understanding of original sin. And slowly the picture emerges that every child born, every babe is already guilty in the eyes of God, damned to eternal perdition, that God demands a sacrifice to appease his wrath, and then provides the victim, and when that picture of salvation and begins to emerge, your piety is pessimistic, isn't it? I mean, the universe is a prison, not one that's been broken open and liberated by Christ, but one from which a few of us can escape if a capricious God is kind enough to give us the secret on how to get out.
Yes.
And also concomitant with that, more and more of the sort of opulent mythology of hell begins to develop, in which hell isn't just a vague name for whatever it is we have to face when we have to face ourselves in the light of God's love. It becomes more and more this perpetual torture chamber that God has devised cunningly to torment most of us throughout eternity. All of that I see as a great corruption and a perversion, but it's also a huge part of the story most of us have received from the past.
Yes. One of the things that we are adamant about discussing, at least, are labels and assumptions that, at least at the level that our work, where our work takes place, we're sort of in the trenches. We discourage people from, even seeing these silly television shows about ghost hunting, etc., because we feel it's ridiculous and it's dangerous, even physically, never mind spiritually and psychologically, etc., etc.
It can be entertaining if you've got insomnia. I mean,
that's true. Yes, but
I've watched a few of those things. Just remind me of my days in Providence.
Oh yes, and you. I'm sure are being listened to by a number of Providence College graduates and perhaps students. We have a certain following there, and it's nice to have the local connection. So, when were you in Providence?
I guess from 2006 to 2009, I was the occupant of what at that time, I think it still is, a rotating chair, a visiting professorship, and then I stayed on 2 more years. So it was a very happy time. I have many friends there.
Oh. Well, that's quite recent. We went on the air in 2008. Too bad we didn't know you then. That would have been interesting. So, but in any case, when it comes to labels, things of this kind, our particular work, and I'd like to get your reaction to this, we do run into what, by the end of the 1970s, after I'd been thrown out of St. Vladimir Seminary for researching the paranormal, we talked about that when we spoke on the phone. But there was an issue with things that I came to call parasites, whose theology did not seem to match what the garden variety demon interpretation would suggest, and an entirely new paradigm seemed to come. And to this day, 50 years later, we're still kind of using this. And when Ben joined me when he was 13, and there have been certain parasitical entities we believe we've encountered, in several cases they have expressed sorrow and maybe not sorrow but regret, at least, to their hosts in one form or another, that they had to live this way. That's unusual, but it's really an entirely sort of deeper thing, and if we're interpreting it properly, and if the people who are involved in these cases interpret it correctly, then there seems to be a certain amount of repentance, if I may use the word, among some of these what would traditionally be known as demons, and I find that very intriguing. I don't know. Have you ever? I don't know how much in the trenches experience you may have had, or whatever.
Well, none of that. No.
No.
And actually, I'm afraid I'm unfamiliar with your program, so I wouldn't even be able to say that I've encountered the descriptions before.
Sure.
I have no idea. I mean, I have actually encountered cases of exorcism and possession. In fact, with real physical manifestations, actually. It was something that happened in my extended family back in the 70s, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the nature, a universalist does actually believe that all spiritual beings are capable of repentance and regret, so that is not intuitively problematic for me, but I'm afraid I can't really give you any information or any insight on what you may have experienced or what conclusions you may have drawn from that.
Yeah, very, very honest answer, which we like. Okay, we're going to take our bottom of the hour break. You're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON, 1240 AM and 99.5 FM in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley. And we're right back with our amazing guest, Dr. David Bentley Hart. So stay with us.
Hi, this is Joe Callahan, host of Coffee Ann, the longest-running panel discussion show in American radio. You never know what topic will pop up on Coffee Ann. So join us weekday mornings 8 to 9 on ON 1240 WOON Woonsocket Radio.
ON Radio, ON Worldwide.
Well, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM and 99.5 FM in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley. Our guest today is Dr. David Bentley Hart, theologian, prolific author, and we're talking about the devil and the possibility that the devil may cease to be the devil, I suppose, essentially, in whatever epochs there are to come. And we've talked about maybe some of the assumptions that you have to, or we will talk about some of the assumptions that you really have to have in order to even approach this subject. But then again, I think Dr. Hart has pretty much set that to rest with the more cosmic view of restoration as opposed to, individual pigeonholed beliefs.
Or, if you will, a reorientation.
Yes, reorientation, yes. But unfortunately, most of the people we deal with, and people from the Western mind, the mind that grew up around Greek, European, and later American philosophy and theology, I suppose.
I'd throw in probably some more nihilistic philosophy in there, and how that sort of molded sort of the mythology of people nowadays, at the very least.
Yes. Well, the issue of course, the personal devil and this sort of thing, you have to people assume that there is one, and also people assume that their particular religious point of view is correct. And I just, as an observer over 50 years or so from my own student days, I find that people don't generally understand the doctrines of their own religions, if there are any set doctrines. Some of them really don't. And certainly people have this sort of cartoonish view of an afterlife, and even of any kind of salvation. So did you have any comment on that sort of thing? I would think you'd be very frustrated dealing with Western students of the Western persuasion when it comes to trying to explain many of these concepts.
Well, students of any persuasion, to be honest, most undergraduate, let's be honest, how many undergraduate, unless you are dealing with a small group that's actively seeking knowledge on these things and hasn't been forced into a survey course, you're not going to encounter many people who've spent years thinking about these things. We do. I mean, I don't want to seem dismissive. I mean, sometimes a simple view is the one you need to get you through life. Mm-hmm. I'm not, this isn't a moral condemnation. Again, as I said, negative reviews of the book have misrepresented the ferocity of some of the language as directed towards persons, and that's not what it is. It's that we have come, many of us, to paint ourselves into corners with these simplistic pictures, to the point that we begin to ascribe to God, while at the same time calling him, good and just and loving, motives and acts and a sense of justice that we would be ashamed to ascribe to another human being, unless we knew that human being was a genuinely evil person. So the question is, how did we get there? And that's what most people don't want to think about. They don't want to see if there's a fundamental incoherence at the very core of the system of beliefs that they've tacitly presumed and that they use vaguely but pragmatically to guide them through the years. So no, I don't know if it's frustration, but most of us, most say Christians, do have a remarkably, as you say, cartoonish, let's say caricatured picture not only of the teachings of Christianity, but of the tradition and of its history.
So that being said, you brought up a really interesting point, which is some of the acts that are ascribed to God if you ascribe to another human being, it would just be shameful.
Yeah.
So would the next logical step, and I say this because there has been a rise in the quote unquote religion of Satanism, would the next logical step be sort of saying, well, if God's this evil thing, why don't I just go and worship Satan?
Well, if nuclear options are all we've got, what I would say is that the rise of disenchantment with Christianity and the rise also at times of a kind of radical nihilism in the way Western humanity, I don't just mean Latin Christianity, I mean the whole of post-Christian culture, tends to view reality, the reduction of everything to a kind of mechanistic materialist calculus, is in point of fact an understandable reaction to pictures of God that became progressively more intolerable to conscience.
Yes.
To me, an atheist has a clearer, truer view of God than a strict traditional Calvinist or Thomist. And by Thomist, I mean the school of Thomism, which, if you know anything about it, is just as predestinarian and problematic morally as Calvinism or Jansenism, and that at that point the embrace of atheism makes sense, because at least you're embracing, in rejecting that picture out of moral indignation, you're embracing the good. And if you had a clarified understanding of who and what God is, you would identify God with the good anyway. So an atheist is a better Christian, perhaps, than one who clings to these images of God that make him worse than any devil could ever be.
Well, that resonates with me. I remember as part of pastoral training in the seminary, because I was never ordained, and probably the church and I both had a lucky escape, I don't know, but there was a certain amount of hospital involvement, visitations.
I've known some very good priests in the Orthodox world. So.
So as have I. Most of them are ones I've known are wonderful. However, in the course of pastoral training, and this was a lot of it in the Roman Catholic seminary before I went to the Orthodox seminary, there were a number of deathbeds at which I was present. Most of them I did not know. 4 of them were atheists. One of them was a doctor. And one learns very quickly that on one's deathbed, all theology, all things that we consider so important fall away, and it's you and God standing you're standing naked before God, as a matter of fact. And it was just something. But the atheists were terrified. Yeah. And every one of them took my hand and they asked about God. Yeah. And I said, I didn't know what to say, but it just came into my heart to tell them, just say thank you. And that's because I remember I was privileged to have among my teachers Father Alexander Schmemann from St. Vladimir's, and he said, and he's
a great man.
Absolutely. And anyone capable of gratitude, this is a paraphrase, is capable of salvation. Yeah. And it's simple and straightforward, and I think the greatest thing we have before God is gratitude. So I think in the end, I forget which of the fathers said it, but all theology ends in silence. Yeah. And I think that
many theologians have said it. Pseudo Dionysius.
Okay. Yeah.
So, you have in mind. Yeah.
But the idea being that it really does, despite all impediments to whatever what we're trying to do. It comes down to simple faith and silence and love and certainly gratitude. So I don't know why I'm rambling on about that, but the notion of atheists really did. They did seem in the end, some of them, very almost better Christians than the Christians.
No, I have a high regard for moral atheism. I wrote books about the new atheists a few years ago. Mm-hmm. But that, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett, but they're not, they were sanctimonious atheists who lack, among other things, even a coherent concept of what it was that most religions teach about God. They just had contempt for those who believed the things they imagined that they believed. And I have no respect for that. I mean, Richard Dawkins is he's a third-tier zoologist who wrote a bad book on genetics. Mm-hmm. But, it's just as bad molecular biology. But his book on God is just, cretinous. I mean, it's just a silly book. But an atheist who's truly rejected a picture of reality that he or she was given, that is morally insufferable, that is incoherent at its core, that says God is love. Excuse me. God is love, and if you don't accept that, he'll torture you forever in order to prove it. That sort of atheist is running away from something, but also towards something more ennobling. A sense of the good, a sense of cosmic justice, a sense of what should be, even if it isn't the case. And in that sense, I think that impulse is truer, to say what the original Christian impulse was and should be, than simple submission of the mind and the will to doctrines that are inherently, as I say, incoherent, but also morally degrading. But I like the image you had of the person, standing naked before God. I mean, a lot of, if you spend time in the Eastern Christian world, then you're aware of this image that you find in the Eastern Christian tradition, but also in the Western spiritual tradition, that says hell is nothing but the love and light of God experienced by a soul that's rejecting love.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Rejecting the love of God, rejecting the love of neighbor, and in that the experience of infinite love is a kind of torment. You experience it as an external chastisement. And that, for the great universalist tradition, not just Clement and Origen, but Gregory of Nyssa and Isaac of Nineveh and Evagrius and Theodore of Mopsuestia and Diodor of Tarsus. There's a long list of them, right up to Sergei Bulgakov in the 20th century, for instance, to take an Orthodox figure. That's what hell is. It's simply the assault of love on the cruelty and selfishness and egotism by which we try to shut others out, by which we try to cut ourselves off from God and other persons and creation as a whole. But because it's the assault of healing love, all of these persons affirm that it is an act of healing. It's not an act of wrath, and that God would not sustain us in existence only to torment us. Isaac of Nineveh says this quite clearly. It would not be the will of God to torment us if that's all it were. Rather, it is a process of healing and restoration. So all of these classical universalists, and I talk about them in the book, did believe in the experience of hell. They believed in all the things that one would fear at death, but they did not see it as wrath. They saw it as the judgment of love. Well, in a sense, I mean, if that's the existential situation, some of these atheists are already farther along the path towards reconciliation with God.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more.
Believe in an arid sense, but in their hearts don't have the moral sensitivity to rebel against an evil picture of God.
Yeah. Well, and not to keep picking on atheists, but I will always ask. I always think that not sort of unbelief requires just as much reason as belief.
Yeah.
And I will ask them very often, and there are many whom I respect very much, and I will say, what God don't you believe in?
Yeah.
And very often, and they'll describe some caricature, as you say, of something I don't believe in either, or something or other. Sometimes they'll just say, well, not nobody, not know how, and
well, I wrote a book, I think it came out in 2013, called The Experience of God, which is just about this. In a sense, that's just the question: what God is it that you don't believe in? And then that's not a specifically Christian book. It draws on Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, all sorts of traditions, to point out that the God that you get in popular atheism is precisely the God that all of these classical traditions have already rejected anyway. So, I don't find atheism morally problematic at all, and in many respects, I hold a truly morally motivated atheist in much higher esteem than someone who will submit to a picture of God that, as I say, I find morally degrading.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just to return to an earlier theme that we touched upon, and there's something that sort of haunts me. Sorry for the pun. I guess the issue of these parasitical entities we believe that we encounter in the trenches, as I say. They, I don't think there are many that are. I mean, they are alien in a certain sense of the word. That's the feeling one gets in their presence. So I'm not saying these are any kind of ghosts or anything like that. I don't think that's even physically possible under the laws of physics in our world anyway. The whole spirit thing in that sense. But they do seem to be. I'm
not going. Yeah, I wouldn't put too much trust in what the laws of physics can tell us about what's possible in the spiritual realm.
That's true. Except for the multiple worlds interpretation, which would allow just about anything. But that's for another day, I think. But in the issue of the parasites, I suppose.
Well, for any physical state, but I mean, again.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, go.
Yeah. No, but in the issue of the parasites, there's they live by feeding upon what seems to be energy, and the many seem to be and Carl Sagan speculated on the possible existence of plasma-based life forms as opposed to carbon, and all this stuff. But the point being that for them to cease being evil from our point of view, which I would think would be anything that's bad for us, we would interpret as evil, might not be evil for them in the sense that they have to eat. It's like expecting a tiger or a lion to give up preying, Preying, upon the food that it needs. So for me, the idea of evil is, and I hate to say it's relative because that's created a lot of problems, I think, in society. But maybe in the case of these so-called demons or whatever label you want to put on them, is this problematic? Is what's evil for them the same as evil for us as far as any kind of universal salvation is concerned? And how would that be worked out? Or do we even know?
Well, it's for me, it's a purely supposititious question because I'm not convinced of the existence of the sort of things you're discussing.
Sure.
But I do believe that there's an ultimate good and an ultimate truth and beauty. That evil, on the other hand, is not a thing. It's simply a deficiency in regard to that goodness. Mm-hmm. However, of course, there are, when it comes to the good in a purely finite sense, what's good for me now, then my eating the fish is good for me and bad for the fish. But in an ultimate sense, you have to dissociate the limitations of finite experience with whether or not there's a transcendental horizon, so to speak, where there is goodness as such, and that's something that can be experienced in mercy and love and justice, and where those things are absent, the good is absent. So to me, good and evil aren't relative questions, but what is relative is the relationship between the finite momentary goods that we have to choose among with all of their attendant contingencies, some of which are bad, either for us or for others. I mean, it's not just a matter of when I eat a fish, it's good for the fish. If I do something super derogatory, like running into a burning building to try to save someone, I might get terribly burned. So that there's a cost for that as well. That I might suffer, or I may even be emotional later that does damage to me psychologically. So there are all sorts of costs that are attendant on the finite, limited goods we pursue in this world. But I think that in an ultimate sense, in our ability to evaluate things in a more ultimate frame, like I choose this because it's good, not just because it suits my needs, is our way is a sort of inherent intuition we have of the reality of the spiritual horizon of the good that ultimately embraces all creatures and is true for all to the degree that they can approach it.
Go ahead, Ben. Okay.
Sorry, I'm just taking that all in. So that being,
So am I.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Run back the tape to see what I just said.
Yes.
Yeah, no, use it in your lectures. There's the idea that God is constantly pursuing us to reorient us back.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So if that process exists for us, does the same process exist for Satan?
Well, I mean that would be the universalist claim would be that all spiritual beings, all beings, but spiritual beings in particular, that is those that are possessed of intellect and will, have to be restored to union with God. I mean that of course creates the greatest tremors of distaste from people who think they're safeguarding orthodoxy by saying the devil can't be saved. But, again, as I say, this was not the view, say, of Gregory of Nyssa, who's considered a pillar of orthodoxy. He speaks in the catechetical oration of even the devil benefiting from the work of Christ. I mean, if you're going to be logically consistent, the notion that any creature possessed of intellect and will is separated from God is something that is contrary to the will of God.
We're almost through here, but I wanted to give you a chance, Doctor, to talk about your books, where people can find out more about you, websites, where they can get the books, etc.
Well, I don't have a website, but there's this useful one called Amazon, and
Yes.
all my books are available. This book and some others that are attached to it thematically or are part of a continuum were all published by Yale University Press. So, of course, their website would have information on them. From about the most I could say.
All right. Well, there will be links on our site to the books, which I intend to read every one of them, actually. So, can you tell us where you're going? What are you working on now? What's your next quest?
I work in a lot of different spheres, not just religion and theology. So I've got some more. I've published fiction too, and I've got some more of that coming up. But my next big project monograph with Yale is on philosophy of mind, which is where I've done a lot of work in the past. That will bring to fruition a project that's been going on for 6 years, probably.
Okay.
So mind, spirit, soul.
All right, very good.
Nature of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ben, any further questions for our guest? Because we have a lot to think about.
Oh, yes. And it was, Doctor, it was great having you on. And every time I had a question, you answered it in the previous question. And it was rather frustrating, but also very fascinating.
Sort of rude of me, wasn't it? I mean, sorry about that.
No, not at all.
It's not like you could know.
Well, I hope you enjoyed your exotic experience of being on the radio, and we'll be in touch off the air, and thank you again, and maybe we can send you a few of our own books.
Oh, yeah, certainly.
Very good. Okay, well, thank you so much. All right,
Thank
Dr. David Bentley Hart, everyone. Okay, let's get to our announcements here. Okay, well, as the holidays roll merrily along, I hope everyone in America had a nice Thanksgiving. We look forward to the 2020 lecture season and our first event, the New England Parafest in Kittery, Maine in April. Stay tuned for more details as the date approaches.
And you can check out our books. They include a couple of amazing titles. If I do say so myself, Behind the Paranormal, Everything You Know Is Wrong, and Behind the Paranormal 2, Bigfoot, Mothman, and Monsters You've Never Heard Of. And now Dancing Past the Graveyard, Poltergeists, Parasites, Parallel Worlds, and God. And they're available from online retailers and in some stores, but for autographed copies, please visit our online bookstore at BehindTheParanormal.com.
Okay, and that site is up again. Sometimes it's not. You can find out more about the show, our many cases over the years, our public appearances, and how to book us, along with some of our 850 free recorded shows. They've been restored from 2019 all the way back to 2011. We've been on the air for almost 12 years, and those are available on the various podcast sites that are popular, Apple iTunes, also Spotify and all the different ones, because we have trouble keeping them on our site. There seems to be attacks constantly on that, and they come down, they're there, they're not. So, but they are available so far on these sites, and we are working on 2010, getting them back, and then we'll do 2009, 2008. So, we have a long way to go, but still, there are plenty there.
Baby steps.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so we've got some charities.
We have a few charities, quite a few actually. You can find out more about these charities, which include USA Cares, Canadian Veterans Advocacy, helping Haiti's orphans, Youth Mentoring Connections in Los Angeles, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America, and the Sisterhood of Ground Zero. And you can find several links to these at our website, BehindTheParanormal.com.
And we do emphasize that we know the people who run these charities. These are not your mega charities where most of the money goes to administration. You can trust these, and we really check them out. And as I say, we know most of these people, so they're good charities. So Ben, what do we have coming up for next week?
So next week, that's next Sunday, December 15th, we'll bring you an open line show to answer listener questions on many subjects with our favorite guest co-host, that's Shane Searway. And I must admit, him braving the wild norths in New Hampshire, coming down with various swings in weather and climate.
Shane is amazing.
I'm amazed that he comes down and he's like, okay, cool, yeah, we'll see you next time, and he leaves immediately.
Yeah. Well, I hope he realizes we've got not only an open line show next week, but 2 weeks after that as well, because we just cannot catch up with the communications that we receive pretty much from all over the world, and we do our best to answer them. So there will be open lines next week, and then the week after that there will be we'll have Nick Redfern on. He's always amazing. And then we'll have open lines the week after that on the 28th of December. So it'll be quite the run, I think, for Shane coming down. So we leave you this afternoon with a sobering thought from American author David Wong. That's actually a pseudonym. The greatest trick the devil pulled was convincing the world there was only one of him. What do you think of that, Ben?
Well, I think many things.
Yeah. I'm inspired after this show. I think it was really an amazing guest, and I think there's plenty to think about. I hope we didn't leave anybody behind with the deep theological discussions, but it's all relevant to what we believe and what we are, and it's important. So there we are. So we do thank you for listening in. Check out our website, BehindTheParanormal.com. And there's information also on our case histories at NewEnglandGhosts.com. That's actually our main site, and we invite you to check that out. It's in dire need of updating, but we're working on that. So anyway, I am Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno. And thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey, and we shall see you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.